Think you know ruthless rulers, the kind who built empires, commanded armies, and reshaped history? Well, prepare yourself, because some of the world's most powerful emperors were not just cruel leaders. They were walking disasters who literally poisoned themselves in their desperate search for immortality. And no story captures this madness better than that of China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, and the bizarre, fatal obsession with drinking liquid gold and mercury. Imagine a ruler so terrified of death that he spent his fortune on alchemists, demanded magical potions, and ended up rotting from the inside because of the very elixirs he believed would make him live forever. This is the story of how the richest man in the ancient world tried to buy eternal life, and instead guaranteed himself one of the most grotesque deaths in history. Let us start with Qin Shi Huang himself, the man who unified China in 221 BC. On paper, he was one of the most powerful men to ever live. He standardized currency, weights, measures, and even the written script. He built massive palaces, the beginnings of the Great Wall, and an empire that would define Chinese history for centuries. But beneath all that glory was a terrified man obsessed with one thing: never dying. He was so paranoid about his mortality that he banned anyone from mentioning the word death around him. Scholars who suggested that life was finite were executed on the spot. And instead of preparing for the natural end of life like any sane ruler, he threw his entire empire's resources into chasing alchemy. Now, here is where it gets bizarre. Qin Shi Huang's court alchemists convinced him that immortality could be found in drinking metals, especially mercury, sometimes even molten gold. Today, we know mercury is one of the most toxic substances on Earth, but to the ancient mind, it shimmered like liquid silver, mysterious and magical. The emperor believed it was a divine element that could preserve flesh forever, so he consumed it in staggering amounts. His meals were laced with mercury pills, his drinks infused with elixirs, and he even ordered entire lakes of mercury to be constructed in his tomb to mirror the heavens. This was not symbolic. This was literal ingestion of poison on a royal scale, and the results were catastrophic. Instead of granting eternal youth, the mercury destroyed his nervous system. Ancient records describe the emperor becoming increasingly erratic, flying into fits of rage, forgetting conversations, and suspecting plots everywhere. He developed tremors, paranoia, and violent mood swings, classic signs of mercury poisoning. Imagine the leader of the most advanced empire in the world, losing his grip on reality because he believed drinking toxic metal was the secret to living forever. His own obsession was corroding his brain from within. But Qin Shi Huang was not the only one. His obsession set off a trend among other rulers in Asia and beyond. Centuries later, emperors and nobles would follow the same path, demanding immortality elixirs from alchemists. In some cases, these potions were made of powdered jade, arsenic, or literal melted gold, substances that slowly poisoned the very rulers they were supposed to protect. The irony is breathtaking. Men who had everything, palaces, armies, unimaginable wealth, were so terrified of death that they guaranteed it by swallowing their own fortune in toxic form. And the paranoia only grew worse. Qin Shi Huang believed assassins were constantly after him. He rarely slept in the same palace twice, ordered underground tunnels so he could move unseen, and forced his servants to test all his food and drink. But no assassin's blade could harm him the way his own medicine did. By the end, he was suffering constant pain, losing control of his mind, and becoming increasingly monstrous to everyone around him. But it does not end there. The emperor's death itself was a nightmare straight out of a horror story. He died on a journey in 210 BC, likely from mercury poisoning. His officials, terrified of the chaos that would follow, tried to cover it up, but the body was decomposing so rapidly from the toxins inside him that the stench became unbearable. Legend has it that carts of rotting fish were dragged alongside his corpse just to mask the smell. As the procession moved back to the capital, the most powerful man in the world, the supposed immortal emperor, was literally rotting in his own golden carriage, his secret finally exposed. If you thought the emperor's habit of drinking poison was strange, wait until you hear about the lengths he went to in order to cheat death. Qin Shi Huang did not just want a potion of eternal youth. He wanted his entire world engineered to keep him alive forever, and that meant turning his court into something that resembled a laboratory for madness. Let us start with the alchemists themselves. In modern times, we would call them con artists, but to the emperor, they were men of science, mystics who held the keys to eternal life. These alchemists promised they could create elixirs that combined gold, mercury, and rare herbs to preserve his body against time. Some even claimed they had maps to magical islands where immortals lived, places across the sea that could provide divine substances. Qin Shi Huang spent unimaginable sums funding these expeditions, sending entire fleets of ships chasing after myths. Historical records suggest that one such voyage may have taken hundreds of young men and women out into the Pacific, never to return. Instead of discovering the secret of immortality, they likely starved at sea, all because their ruler was too afraid to face the reality of human death. And the paranoia did not stop there. Every time an elixir failed, every time he felt his health worsening, Qin Shi Huang lashed out. Servants were executed, even doctors killed for failing to deliver the impossible. The emperor's obsession poisoned not only his body but his court. What might have been one of the most brilliant administrations in ancient history became a climate of fear, where men competed to invent the next deadly cure. But what about the emperor's daily rituals? Well, they were nothing short of surreal. He refused to eat meals that had not been tasted by several servants first, terrified of assassins. He ordered all palace kitchens to be sealed and guarded, with food preparation treated like a military operation. But here is the irony. While he worried about external poisons, he willingly swallowed the toxic metals his alchemists handed him. The kitchen was on lockdown, yet the danger was served directly to him by his most trusted advisors. His eating habits reflected his obsession. Qin Shi Huang believed certain foods could extend his lifespan, and he consumed them in extreme quantities. Just like Henry VIII devouring swan meat for grace, Qin believed that rare animals and precious minerals carried divine energy. He drank concoctions of jade powder mixed with wine, ate dishes sprinkled with crushed pearls, and consumed mercury-laced syrups that burned his throat as they went down. To him, pain was a sign that the elixir was working, proof that the substance was fighting death inside him. In reality, it was fighting his organs and winning. The emperor also forced his court into bizarre rituals to match his obsession. When an alchemist declared that immortality required avoiding evil spirits, Qin Shi Huang banned the use of certain words, ordered people to avoid specific directions when walking, and even outlawed building roofs in certain shapes because he believed demons would crawl through them. He was molding the empire's laws, not around justice or order, but around his own escalating fear of mortality. Imagine an entire nation bending its rules to accommodate one man's phobia of death. And then there were the tours. Qin Shi Huang refused to stay in one palace for long, convinced that assassins were waiting for him. So he traveled constantly, moving through secret tunnels, and staying in newly constructed palaces that cost fortunes to build. Courtiers often had no idea where he was at any given time, because he deliberately spread false rumors about his location. He even commissioned massive underground roads so he could travel unseen. While the empire strained under the cost of endless wars and construction, their ruler was playing hide-and-seek with death itself. It gets stranger. Some of Qin Shi Huang's closest advisors began claiming they were in contact with immortals, spirit beings who would guide the emperor to eternal life. These mystics performed elaborate ceremonies, burning strange herbs, chanting into the night, and presenting potions that were essentially poison mixed with perfume. The emperor bought it all. He was convinced that these rituals would carry him beyond the reach of time, and he rewarded the charlatans with riches and titles. Many of them quietly disappeared once their cures began killing courtiers. The emperor's fear turned him into prey for frauds who understood how to profit from paranoia. And then came the darkest irony of all. Qin Shi Huang's search for immortality directly weakened his dynasty. While he chased impossible cures, his people were burdened with heavy taxes to fund these schemes. Farmers were forced into labor for his Great Wall projects, alchemists drained the treasury with empty promises, and soldiers were sent to guard expeditions that sailed into nothingness. The dream of living forever was not just killing the emperor, it was killing his empire. By the late years of his reign, Qin Shi Huang was no longer seen as a strong leader, but as a sickly tyrant, lashing out at anyone who dared remind him of his mortality. He demanded that every courtier praise his glowing health, even as his body trembled from mercury poisoning. He punished physicians who suggested moderation. He even declared that speaking of death in his presence was treason. Imagine a palace where the most obvious truth of life, that all men die, was the one subject no one could mention. So here we have an emperor whose paranoia reshaped a nation, whose fear funded expeditions into nowhere, whose body was rotting from the very cures he demanded. But if you think it ends with his death on the road, you are mistaken. Because what he left behind, his tomb and its horrifying secrets, might be the most chilling legacy of all. By the year 210 BC, Qin Shi Huang's body had become a battlefield of poisons. His hands trembled, his moods swung violently, and his mind was so clouded by mercury that he barely recognized the men who served him. But still, he refused to stop taking the so-called elixirs. Each new potion was another chance to outwit death. Each swallow of mercury was a gamble that maybe, just maybe, this time it would work. Instead, the toxins finally won. The emperor collapsed while traveling through eastern China. He was only 49 years old, but his body looked decades older, swollen, sickly, and ravaged by the very substances meant to preserve him. His sudden death threw his court into chaos. After all, this was the man who claimed he would never die. To admit he had succumbed to poison and paranoia would have shattered the myth of divine rule. So, his officials did something extraordinary. They tried to hide the emperor's death. Here is how desperate it got. The body began to decompose almost immediately. The smell was unbearable. His attendants panicked and ordered carts of rotting fish to travel with the royal procession. The idea was simple. If anyone smelled something foul, they would assume it came from the fish, not the emperor's corpse rotting inside the carriage. Imagine the scene. The most powerful man in the known world, proclaimed as eternal, secretly hauled across the countryside in a stinking parade of fish guts and decaying flesh. The irony is almost too perfect. But that was not even the most grotesque part of his afterlife. Qin Shi Huang had spent decades designing his tomb, a monument that reflected his obsession with cheating death. Buried beneath a massive mound in modern-day Xi'an lies one of the most astonishing archaeological sites ever discovered. The Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized soldiers, horses, and chariots were crafted in clay to serve him in the next world. Each statue was unique, detailed down to individual hair strands, as if the emperor was trying to rebuild his empire underground. He believed that even in death, his power must continue. And then there are the rivers. Ancient records describe Qin Shi Huang's tomb as a miniature cosmos. The ceilings painted with stars, the floor mapped with mountains and seas. But instead of water, the rivers and oceans were crafted with flowing mercury, literal streams of liquid metal designed to glisten like eternity itself. Scientists who tested the soil around the tomb found mercury levels dozens of times higher than normal, confirming that the legend was true. Even in death, the emperor surrounded himself with the very poison that destroyed him. His tomb is quite literally a toxic monument. The construction of that tomb was as brutal as it was ambitious. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were forced to work on it, many of whom never left. Historical accounts claim that artisans and workers who knew the secrets of the burial site were executed or sealed inside to keep the tomb's mysteries hidden. For Qin Shi Huang, the afterlife was not just a continuation of life, it was a military campaign. He wanted armies, rivers, palaces, and secrecy, all guarded by the bodies of the men who built it. And here is the chilling part. The tomb itself has never been fully excavated. Archaeologists have uncovered the Terracotta Army, but the central chamber remains untouched, not only because of concerns about damaging the relics, but because the levels of mercury inside might still be deadly. Over 2,000 years later, Qin Shi Huang's paranoia lingers. His tomb is literally too poisonous to open. The emperor who tried to live forever still reaches across the centuries with the same toxins that destroyed him. But his legacy did not stop with his burial. His obsession set a precedent. Later emperors of China continued to seek out immortality potions, repeating his mistakes. Some overdosed on mercury pills. Others swallowed concoctions of arsenic, jade, or even powdered gold. One Tang Dynasty emperor was said to glow pale yellow in his final days after years of consuming gold elixirs. Another Ming ruler drank so much mercury that his body collapsed while still in his 30s. The cycle repeated again and again, wealth and fear creating a perfect recipe for self-destruction. Qin Shi Huang had shown that even absolute rulers, men who commanded millions, were powerless in the face of mortality. Yet instead of learning, they doubled down. And there is a larger irony. For all his fear of being forgotten, Qin Shi Huang succeeded in the one way he never expected. He is remembered not for eternal life, but for his failure to achieve it. His empire collapsed within years of his death, torn apart by rebellion and corruption. The dynasty he built vanished almost instantly, undone by the very paranoia that drove him. But his story, grotesque and cautionary, has lasted over 2 millennia. The man who feared death became immortal after all, not in body, but in infamy. Think about the image that survives. The emperor trembling with poisoned hands, drinking another glowing potion, convinced that agony meant it was working. His attendants gagging as they marched with carts of fish to hide the smell of his corpse. His tomb sealed with rivers of poison that even today leak into the earth. And thousands of clay soldiers standing guard over a man who destroyed himself. That is Qin Shi Huang's eternity. Not paradise, not eternal youth, but a warning carved into history. So, what can we take from the bizarre case of the emperor who drank liquid gold? It is a story about power twisting into fear, about brilliance sabotaged by obsession. A reminder that no matter how much wealth you have, no matter how high you rise, you cannot buy your way out of mortality. Qin Shi Huang conquered kingdoms, reshaped China, commanded millions, and still he fell to the same truth as every farmer, soldier, and servant in his empire. Death comes for all. In chasing immortality, he only hastened his own decay. And maybe that is the ultimate lesson. Absolute power does not make you a god. It makes you vulnerable to your own worst instincts. Qin Shi Huang turned his fear into a national project, consumed poisons disguised as miracles, and left behind a tomb so toxic we are still afraid to open it. His body rotted, his dynasty collapsed, but his cautionary tale endures. So the next time you hear about kings and emperors chasing eternal life, remember Qin Shi Huang, remember the rivers of mercury, the rotting procession hidden by fish, the army of clay guardians, and remember that immortality often comes not from elixirs or palaces, but from the sheer horror of your mistakes.